The first ever Dungeons & Dragons video game came out in 1988, and this was Pool of Radiance. This game featured classes, alignments, and combat options drawn straight from AD&D. It was the first game that wanted to morph the tabletop experience into a video game, and it allowed things such as the agency to talk your way out of sketchy situations. There were several more D&D based CRPGs that came out throughout the years after, but post Neverwinter Nights 2 in 2009, the genre started to die. In 2019, however, we got a pleasant surprise as Baldur's Gate 3 was initially announced. Looking from the outside in, BG3 can be a little confusing as to what exactly it is, especially if you're not that familiar with D&D or even the CRPG genre as a whole, and I think you're going to want to have a listen and take a look, as that's what I'm doing this video for. But do you know what you wouldn't want to do if you visited the city of Baldur's Gate in its 21st century version? You wouldn't want to use the city's public Wi-Fi services without using Surfshark VPN. Thank you to Surfshark VPN for sponsoring this video. So a VPN is a virtual private network that will encrypt your personal online data so that no one can track or steal it. And this can help with gaming, general phone browsing, and of course sending and receiving files. On top of this, a VPN will allow you to do things such as gain access to region-locked games, and it can also help you get the best possible deals on game purchases. Because with Surfshark, you can be from many countries, as it lets you change the location of your IP address while also staying extremely private and secure. When I used to visit Thailand for extended periods of time, Surfshark allowed me to play some games that were blocked in Thailand, and it also allowed me to see all of the Netflix shows that were blocked when using a Thailand IP address. I was able to connect back home and still experience those home comforts. Now, the great thing about using Surfshark is that your account can be used on an unlimited amount of devices. They have 24/7 support, they don't collect data as they have a strict no-log policy, and there's a 30-day money-back guarantee. So try it out yourself. There's a ton of other benefits and use cases that I didn't even mention in this video, and you can learn more and download the VPN by using my link below or by scanning this QR code. Make sure to use promo code WolfhearT to get 83% off in 3 months for free. There's some great deals going on. Back to the video. If you're new around here, my channel name is WolfheartFPS, yet I cover RPGs. Baldur's Gate 3 has been a huge part of my channel for over 3 years now, as I took an immediate interest in it when Larian Studios, the company behind this game, put out their first announcement trailer back in 2019. This particular trailer gave us an exciting look into some potential plot elements for this RPG, and anyone who was somewhat familiar with Dungeons & Dragons lore, whether through tabletop, video games, or books, likely recognized this creature right here, which is called the Mind Flayer. Mind flayers eat sentient brains for nutrients, and they also lay eggs that hatch tadpoles. When these tadpoles are inserted to the brain of a moderately intelligent humanoid, that humanoid goes through ceramorphosis, which is the process of painfully morphing into a mind flayer. A different cinematic, the opening cinematic for Baldur's Gate 3's early access, shows us, the player, getting a tadpole put into our brain, and this is how our story begins. Now, I'm not going to give or show any true spoilers in this video. The gameplay that you'll be seeing is mostly from the tutorial area or very early in Act 1 of Early Access. So not long after that initial announcement trailer was released, Larian would announce that Baldur's Gate 3 is going to be based on D&D 5th edition rules and mechanics. Those of you who may not be that familiar with this terminology, basically over the lifetime of the tabletop game Dungeons & Dragons, the game's rules and mechanics and the setting itself have changed and evolved, and this is the birth of new D&D editions. The current edition of tabletop D&D is called 5th edition, and 5th edition comes with several manuals to lay out the rules, with the core books being the Player's Handbook, the Dungeon Master's Guide, and the Monster Manual. Larian Studios announced that their video game, Baldur's Gate 3, was going to be largely based on those 3 books. In tabletop D&D, typically the Dungeon Master is the one who enforces these rules, lays out the general premise for an adventure or a quest, and then they offer guidance and try to loosely steer their players in a direction that will make for a fun experience. The players have a lot of agency though, and they get to make a lot of really important decisions that the Dungeon Master has to react to. In Baldur's Gate 3, Larian Studios is essentially the Dungeon Master. And although in a video game, rules and parameters are going to have to be more defined and more strict, as you don't have a human who on the spot can adapt to any and everything that a player comes up with, players in Baldur's Gate 3 will still get a ton of agency over how their experience turns out. In Baldur's Gate 3, you'll be able to go down a more evil path, and the game will react to your decisions, and your experience will end up being different in many ways than a player who plays a goody two-shoes. You can choose to play as a female drow, and in D&D lore, most drow live in strict, intense matriarchal societies. This simple choice in character creation will give that particular player the opportunity to experience unique dialogues, and there can be a different turn of events in certain situations compared to a player who chooses to play as a halfling or even a male drow. When you're in potential combat situations, there's handfuls of ways to solve your problems. Some players will resort to straight-up frontline combat. Others will look for more clever ways to defeat their opponents by using the environment to their advantage. And then there's players who would prefer to try some tricky wordplay to get safely through a situation. Baldur's Gate 3 is a game that gives a ton of agency for a video game to the player, and gives the player power over their experience, while at the same time the game will retain an overarching plot that all players will be involved with, and of course there's going to be the possibility of different outcomes. Player agency along with a game setting is perhaps one of the most important aspects of Dungeons & Dragons, and Larian is putting a lot of time into making that a reality in BG3. Now most of the rules and mechanics of BG3 come right from the 3 D&D 5th edition manuals that I mentioned earlier. Larian is of course not the first company to do something like this, and this is a type of formula that many prior D&D video games took on in the past, but with different D&D editions of course, and different philosophies in terms of how strict or lenient they want to be with the rules. Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 were based on 2nd edition Dungeons & Dragons. Although Larian is lenient in certain areas of the rules, and they have formed many of their own homebrew rules, and homebrew is the D&D terminology for making new rules or changing rules. Largely, Baldur's Gate 3 does follow 5th edition rules and mechanics. If you master Baldur's Gate 3, you'll be able to understand Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition very easily, and if you've already played D&D 5e, BG3 is going to be really easy to understand. When I say rules and mechanics, I'm talking about aspects of the game such as turn-based combat, classes and races, class design, spells and abilities, skills, weapons, modifiers, ability scores, and so much more. And of course, most of the mechanics in this game revolve around rolling the dice. This RNG dice concept can be a little confusing for players who have never played a video game that actually makes you roll digital dice. For example, if you're trying to pick a lock in BG3, you gotta roll a digital die that has 20 sides on it. And then the game will add modifiers to your roll depending on how you've built that particular character, and that final number will go up against a difficulty class number that Larian has assigned to that particular lock. There's a lot of RNG going on, which is random number generation, but at the same time, depending on your character's build, your percentage chance for success may drastically improve or decrease in certain situations. Your choices with your character builds are really important, and your character will have real purpose. You'll want to pick locks with a party member that has proficiency in the sleight of hand skill, which will give them better modifiers leading to a higher roll number. Even in combat, the game is rolling dice left and right, but in combat the majority of this is done behind the scenes. The same general concept as with the lockpicking applies here. Characters who are built certain ways stand a better chance of landing particular attacks with particular weapons or spells, etc. Now some people don't like RNG mechanics, but RNG is actually common in many video games, even action RPGs. You know how sometimes you randomly get that massive critical hit in an action RPG? This is many times an RNG system working in the background determining your damage. The biggest difference here is that most of those games don't really allow you to miss if you're targeting correctly. They just give you lousy damage numbers. In Baldur's Gate 3, if you fail your attack roll, you will miss. Another very important D&D aspect about this game that you should at least understand how it works is the game's lore and story. Those of you who are not familiar with how overall D&D lore works, you're going to want to hear this section out, as it's the biggest reason as to why I'm personally excited for Baldur's Gate 3. Baldur's Gate 3 is part of official D&D lore. Dungeons & Dragons lore as a whole has a really large timeline that mixes tabletop adventures, video games, and even books all into one, although I should mention that it's not always perfectly done. The particular D&D setting that I'm referring to here is called the Forgotten Realms setting. Looking at a few previous D&D Forgotten Realms games, Baldur's Gate 1 takes place in 1368 Dale Reckoning on the Forgotten Realms timeline. BG2 is in 1369 DR, and BG3 is over 120 years later in 1492 DR. There's so much D&D history from before those times, between those times, during those times, and there will be a lot after those times. If you're someone who read the Legend of Drizzt book series by author R.A. Salvatore, those books take place in the times before BG 1 and 2, and they continue all the way to present-day Baldur's Gate 3. Some of the characters in the Legend of Drizzt books even appear in BG 1 and 2, and we might even see them in BG 3. All of this is ultimately controlled by Wizards of the Coast, the company that owns the D&D license. So if a new author comes into the picture, they have to get a license from Wizards of the Coast first, and then they have to become an expert on all of the Forgotten Realms canon history to be able to incorporate their story into this gigantic timeline. It works the same way for many D&D based video games. Baldur's Gate 3 will be putting what seems to be a huge imprint on that D&D Forgotten Realms timeline. It's really cool to think that 50 years from now, if D&D is still around, someone might be looking back at the D&D timeline, reading about the events in BG3 that likely had a big effect on the overall lore. Or perhaps they'll be playing a D&D video game in 50 years from now, and they'll pick up a book in that game that references events that happened in Baldur's Gate 3. I really enjoy being a part of this, and I have been a part of it before Baldur's Gate 3 even existed, and this is one of the biggest reasons as to why I'm excited for Baldur's Gate 3. Now, since we're on the topic of lore and story, many people do ask the question of, do I have to have played Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 to enjoy Baldur's Gate 3? The answer to that is no, you definitely don't have to have played BG 1 and 2 to enjoy Baldur's Gate 3. Larian is well aware that it's not really reasonable to sell a game to a large modern audience and expect that audience to all play games from 20 plus years ago. So the relations that BG3 will have to BG 1 and 2 should be explained well by Larian in simple and understandable terms in Baldur's Gate 3 itself. But you'll definitely miss a few of the Easter eggs if you don't play the originals, and I would recommend that you do because they're fantastic games. At this current time, we don't even really know how the story of Baldur's Gate 3 will tie into the originals, and of course to what extent that will occur. We do know, though, that Larian has said that it will tie into the original games in meaningful ways, and we see a lot of references to some of the gods that played large parts in the original games that are also going to play a large role in Baldur's Gate 3. So hopefully now you have a better understanding of what this game is going to be and where it kind of falls into the bigger picture. From everything that I've seen, Larian Studios is going all out with this project, and they're putting more time and resources into it than any company has done ever with a CRPG. Even if it ends up not being your style of game, perhaps you don't like turn-based combat, or maybe you're not into the plot, what Larian is doing here, in my opinion, is good for the gaming industry as a whole. We need more companies that value quality as a core part of their profit strategy. I think BG3 is going to help play a role in the resurrection of the D&D CRPG genre. If it turns out great, and I think it will, this is good for all CRPG fans, because you bet your butt that other companies are going to be encouraged to follow that model, and Larian will prove that the D&D CRPG genre is certainly not dead. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you on a future video.